The warmth of the sun on his skin and the rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing on the shore felt like a distant dream to Ethan Parker. For once, he was not racing against time, not battling criminals or solving high-stakes cases that had long haunted his every waking moment. For once, he was truly present with his family, his wife Lena, and their two children Jackson and Emily, at a luxurious beachside resort far from the pressure of his job as an FBI agent. Ethan was a man used to the weight of responsibility, the constant state of vigilance that came with his career in law enforcement. He had spent years in high-pressure situations, confronting criminals, protecting lives, and keeping his family safe from the dangers of his work. But today, as he leaned back on a poolside lounge chair, he allowed himself to relax for the first time in what felt like forever. His dark sunglasses shielded his eyes from the glaring midday sun, and the cold drink in his hand provided a rare sense of comfort. Beside him, Lena sat with a book in her hands, her gaze occasionally drifting toward the children. Lena, a successful lawyer in her own right, had always been the backbone of their family. A strong, intelligent woman with a fierce passion for justice, she had spent her life defending the rights of the underprivileged and marginalized. But just like Ethan, she rarely had time for herself. Today, they both wanted nothing more than to escape from the demands of their professions, to enjoy a brief respite from the constant stress. Jackson, their 12-year-old son, was in the shallow end of the pool racing against his 7-year-old sister, Emily. Jackson, tall and mature for his age, had inherited his father's competitive spirit, always striving to prove himself. Emily, on the other hand, was a sweet and energetic child, her laughter contagious, as she swam beside her older brother. Both kids, oblivious to the world around them, were the picture of happiness. Their innocent joy was a reminder of why Ethan and Lena had worked so hard to give them a life free from fear and struggle. For a few precious moments, everything felt right. Ethan glanced at his family, his heart swelling with pride. The vacation was everything they had hoped for, peaceful, relaxing, and a chance to simply be together. He knew these moments were fleeting, that soon enough they would be pulled back into the whirlwind of their hectic lives. But for now, he allowed himself to soak in the calm. As Ethan reached for his drink, a security guard approached from the distance. At first, Ethan thought nothing of it, perhaps a routine check, just another part of the resort's protocol. But as the guard got closer, Ethan noticed the man's expression. His posture was rigid, his face cool and professional, but there was an unmistakable suspicion in his eyes. "Excuse me, sir," the guard said, his voice polite but firm. "Can I verify that you're a guest here?" Ethan sat up slightly, his eyes narrowing behind his sunglasses. "I'm a guest," he replied, his voice calm but already sensing that something was off. "I'm staying in room 305. The guard hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning Ethan's face. "I'll need to confirm with the front desk," he said, his tone now more matter-of-fact than before. Lena, who had been quietly reading her book, put it down and glanced at Ethan. She could sense the tension in the air even before Ethan spoke. She had been in situations like this before where they were treated differently, where their presence seemed to cause discomfort. And each time it chipped away at her patience. The guard turned and walked away, but Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She exchanged a glance with Ethan, a silent understanding passing between them. This wasn't just a routine check, it was something more. Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to push aside the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. He hoped the guard would return soon with the confirmation they needed, and they could get back to enjoying their day. But as time passed, the tension only grew. Soon the guard returned, not alone, but accompanied by another man, someone who appeared to be of higher authority. Both men walked briskly toward Ethan and Lena, their demeanor suddenly more serious. The polite facade had faded, replaced by a sense of urgency that was hard to ignore. "Sir," the first guard said again, his tone now more insistent. We need you and your family to leave the pool area until we can confirm your information with the front desk." Ethan sat up fully now, the calm composure he had worked so hard to maintain beginning to fray. "I've already told you our room number," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "There's no need to kick us out while you check with the front desk." Lena stood up, her eyes flashing with a mix of confusion and anger. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Why are we being asked to leave when we've done nothing wrong?" The two guards exchanged uneasy glances, but neither of them seemed willing to explain. The second man, who appeared to be the higher-ranking officer, spoke for the first time, his voice cold and detached. "It's just a routine security measure," he said, his words unconvincing. "We've had issues recently with non-guests sneaking into the pool area. This is a policy we need to follow to protect the property." Lena's brow furrowed as she processed the words. "So because we look different from the other guests, you assume we don't belong here?" Her voice was rising, a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Is this policy applied to everyone, or just families like ours?" The guard didn't answer his silence, speaking volumes. Lena could see through the thinly veiled excuse. She had been fighting for justice for years, and this was a battle she was ready to fight. Ethan placed a hand gently on her shoulder, a silent plea to remain calm. But he knew it was difficult for her to contain her anger, especially when they were being treated this way in front of their children. The tension between them and the guards was palpable, but it was clear to everyone in the area that something was very wrong. Other guests were starting to take notice, some whispering to each other, others pulling out their phones to record the exchange. Ethan caught sight of Jackson, his 12-year-old son, standing at the edge of the pool, his face confused. Emily, too, had stopped playing, her wide eyes searching for answers from her parents. Ethan's heart ached for his children. He had spent years trying to protect them from the harsh realities of the world, but today they were facing something no child should ever have to. A father, a federal agent, was being treated like a criminal, and his family was being humiliated because of their appearance. "Let's just go back to our room," Ethan said, his voice low but firm, trying to diffuse the situation. "You can confirm everything with the front desk. There's no need for this to escalate." But it was too late. The situation had already escalated. The guards returned with a new group of people, 2 police officers, both tall and imposing, their uniforms sharp and their faces unreadable. They moved toward Ethan and Lena with a sense of authority, as if they were preparing for something far more serious. "Sir, we received a report about an incident here," one of the officers said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I need to see your identification." Ethan stood tall, his hands at his sides. He had dealt with many tense situations in his career, but this felt different. "I've already explained," he said, his voice calm but filled with the unmistakable authority that came with years of service as an FBI agent. "I'm Ethan Parker, and I'm an FBI agent. My family and I are guests at this resort. There's no reason to treat us like this." The officer looked at Ethan for a long moment, his gaze unblinking. Then he spoke again, but this time his words were dismissive. "Hand over your ID, now." The demand was sharp, and Ethan could hear the challenge in the officer's tone. He was used to authority figures pushing back, but this time the stakes were higher. Lena stood beside him, her anger simmering just below the surface. "He just told you," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Why are you treating him like a criminal?" Ethan sighed, knowing this wasn't going to end easily. "I'll show you my ID," he said, his voice steady. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his FBI badge, presenting it to the officer with a calm that contrasted sharply with the growing tension around them. The officer barely glanced at the badge. "This isn't enough," he muttered. "We need a real form of identification." Lena's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? You're harassing us for no reason. This is unbelievable." Her voice grew louder as she stepped forward, now fully facing the officer. The officer, however, wasn't backing down. "Provide valid ID or we will escalate this." Ethan knew he couldn't let things get out of hand. He calmly reached into his wallet, pulling out his driver's license. "Here it is. Is that enough for you?" But the officer didn't give in. "We're still waiting for confirmation from the hotel," he said coldly. Lena's patience snapped. "This is insane." She turned toward the officer, her voice demanding, "You can't treat us like this. We've done nothing wrong and we're not going anywhere." The weight of the moment began to settle on Ethan. His mind, usually sharp and clear in high-stress situations, was clouded with frustration and disbelief. He had been in countless confrontations with criminals, dangerous individuals who posed real threats to the safety of the country. But now, standing in front of two police officers, one of whom was demanding to see his identification, Ethan felt a sense of helplessness that he had never experienced before. He could feel the tension in the air thickening the silence between him and the officers, creating a space that was too full, too tight. His mind raced through every possible outcome, knowing how quickly a situation like this could spiral out of control if he didn't keep his cool. But even as he remained calm on the outside, anger simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the officer's refusal to acknowledge his identity as an FBI agent. It was the fact that they were treating him like a suspect, a criminal, someone undeserving of respect or dignity. His family, his children were watching this unfold, and Ethan hated that they were seeing this side of the world. Lena, however, was not one to hold back her emotions. The calm, calculated lawyer in her had already been pushed to her limits. She stepped forward, her voice firm and unwavering, her gaze locked on the officers. "You've already heard him," Lena said, her words sharp, like a lawyer in the courtroom demanding justice. "He's an FBI agent. This treatment is completely unacceptable." The younger officer, who had been standing by with his arms crossed, exchanged a glance with his older counterpart, his face full of defiance. It was clear he wasn't used to being challenged in this way. "Ma'am, we're just following procedure," the young officer replied, but his tone lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Following procedure," Lena scoffed. "Is this your idea of procedure? You treat a family like criminals based on nothing but assumptions and prejudice? Is that your policy?" The officer seemed taken aback by her words. He had clearly expected a different reaction, one of submission. But Lena wasn't going to back down. She had fought for justice her entire career, and she wasn't about to let this injustice slide, especially when it was happening to her own family. Ethan watched as the younger officer shifted uncomfortably. The older officer, sensing the growing tension, stepped in. His voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was a subtle edge to it. "Ma'am, we are just trying to make sure everything checks out. There's no need for hostility." Lena's eyes narrowed. "Hostility? You've already humiliated us in front of everyone here. You've scared my children. And now you're telling me there's no need for hostility. Let me tell you something. This is not just about us. This is about a system that treats people differently based on their race, based on their appearance. This is about every other family who has been unjustly targeted and made to feel less than. I will not stand for it." And for... Her words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything she had said and everything she had endured. Ethan felt a deep sense of pride for his wife in that moment, but also a pang of guilt. This wasn't how their family vacation was supposed to go. They had come here to escape from the chaos of their lives, to reclaim a piece of peace and normalcy, and now, this. Jackson, who had been quietly standing nearby, watching the exchange with wide eyes, took a step forward. His voice was tentative, filled with confusion. "Dad, why are they doing this?" His words, innocent and full of hurt, cut through Ethan like a knife. Jackson didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew something was wrong. Ethan crouched down to his son's level, placing a hand on his shoulder. He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "These officers are just doing their job. But we've done nothing wrong. We're not going anywhere. Just go back to playing with Emily, okay? City. Jackson hesitated, still clearly confused, but nodded slowly and returned to his sister. Ethan watched him go, his heart heavy. He had spent so much of his life trying to protect his children from the harsh realities of the world, and now here he was failing to shield them from the very injustice he had fought against his entire career. The two officers continued to stand there, exchanging uneasy glances as the situation grew increasingly tense. People around the pool began to take notice, some filming with their phones, others whispering among themselves. It was as if the entire world had stopped to witness the standoff between the Parker family and the officers. Ethan knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about the people watching, the ones who saw what was happening and would judge the situation based on how the officers handled it. It was about the truth being exposed, the truth that discrimination and bias were still alive and well, even in places that claimed to be above reproach. Can we just go back to our room?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but firm. "We've already answered your questions. If you need to confirm anything, just call the front desk. There's no need to keep us here any longer." The older officer finally spoke, his voice edged with frustration. "You're not going anywhere until we get confirmation from the hotel." Ethan's patience was wearing thin. He had been through this too many times to count. He had dealt with criminals who would stop at nothing to evade justice. But this felt different. This was systemic. This was the kind of injustice that he had sworn to fight against when he first became an agent. But now, standing there handcuffed and surrounded by police officers who refused to recognize his identity, Ethan couldn't help but feel like he was just another victim in a broken system. As he stood there, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs, Ethan knew this wasn't going to end quietly. Lena wasn't going to let it. And neither was he. They weren't going to let their children grow up thinking this was how the world worked, that they had to accept being treated like criminals for no reason other than their appearance. Lena's voice broke through his thoughts. "You want confirmation?" she said, her tone icy. "I'll give you confirmation. My husband is an FBI agent. You're harassing us for no reason, and I will make sure this goes public. You will answer for what you've done." The younger officer flinched, his earlier confidence slipping, but the older officer remained calm, though his eyes now betrayed his growing concern. He knew this wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity anymore. This was escalating. Fast. The situation had reached its breaking point. What had started as a routine check had turned into a full-blown confrontation. The officers had no idea who they were dealing with, and even less idea of the consequences they would face when the truth came out. As the tension continued to mount, Ethan's mind raced. He had to think fast. He had to protect his family, but he also knew that if he resisted too much, things could escalate into violence. He had seen it happen before. He knew how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. But as the younger officer reached for his cuffs again, Ethan knew what he had to do. He couldn't stand there any longer and let this happen. Not to his family. Not to himself. He had to make his move. As the younger officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowed with intent. His hand hovered over the cuffs at his belt. Ethan stood still, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like never before. He had faced criminals, terrorists, and threats to national security without flinching. But now in front of his family with his children, looking on, this felt different. The young officer's voice broke the silence. "Put your hands behind your back," he demanded, his tone firm and unwavering. Ethan could see the tension in the officer's posture, his stance almost daring Ethan to resist. Ethan's mind raced. He knew this was it. He could feel the adrenaline building in his chest. Every fiber of his being screamed to stand up for what was right, to push back against the injustice. But his first responsibility was to his family. He couldn't let this escalate into something worse. Not now, not when his children were watching. "Don't do this," Ethan said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet but undeniable force. His eyes locked onto the officer, trying to convey a message without words. He wasn't just another suspect. He wasn't just another black man who had been mistaken for someone else. He was Ethan Parker, an FBI agent, a father, a husband, and he would not let this moment define him or his family. The officer paused, his hand still hovering over the cuffs. He seemed to waver for just a second, uncertainty creeping into his posture. But then the moment passed. The young officer's expression hardened again, as if he was determined to assert his authority over Ethan. Without another word, he moved forward. Lena, who had been standing by, her eyes blazing with fury, stepped forward immediately. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 courtroom battles. "This is wrong, and you know it. He's an FBI agent, and you have no reason to treat him like this." The older officer, who had been standing off to the side, suddenly seemed to take notice of the growing tension. He glanced at the younger officer, his expression unreadable. But the damage had already been done. The crowd around the pool had stopped what they were doing, and were now watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out recording. Others murmured among themselves, whispering their disapproval. Ethan could feel his children's eyes on him, their confusion and fear palpable. Jackson, his eldest, stood frozen, his gaze darting between the officers and his father, trying to make sense of it all. Emily, his younger daughter, clung to Lena. Her face streaked with tears, her tiny hands gripping her mother's arm as if trying to hold on to some sense of safety. It was a moment Ethan would never forget, the moment he realized the system that he had worked so tirelessly to protect and uphold had now turned its back on him and his family. He had spent his career fighting to defend this country, to ensure justice was served, to make the world a safer place. But here, in front of his children, he was being treated as a criminal. Lena reached out to her husband, her voice shaking but determined. "Ethan, we're not letting this go. We'll fight this. You can't just stand here and let them do this to us." Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her, but he could feel his own emotions swirling inside him. "I know, Lena," he whispered, his voice low but resolute. "We're not going to let them get away with this, but we need to stay calm. If we don't, it could get worse." The younger officer, still standing with his hand poised above his belt, looked over at the older officer, seeking guidance. But the older officer remained silent, his gaze fixed on Ethan and Lena. The younger officer's confidence seemed to wane as the reality of the situation set in. He had never expected such resistance, especially from a family. This wasn't a criminal. This wasn't some random individual he could intimidate into submission. This was an FBI agent, and he had made a mistake. But his pride, his need to assert control, wouldn't let him back down. With a final glance at his superior, he reached for the cuffs again. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said, his voice cold. "Put your hands behind your back, or we will take you in." That was the breaking point. Ethan, who had been holding back, who had been trying to keep the situation from spiraling, finally spoke, his voice unwavering. "No, you're not taking me anywhere. I've already told you who I am. I'm an FBI agent, and I'm done being treated like this." Lena stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her eyes filled with fire. "You'll regret this," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "We'll make sure you pay for this. You'll be held accountable, and we won't stop until you are." The older officer shifted uncomfortably. He had been trying to keep the situation under control, but it was clear this wasn't going to end quietly. His eyes flickered nervously around the pool area, taking in the growing crowd. The phones were still recording. The whispers were getting louder. This was no longer just a simple case of mistaken identity or a minor disturbance. It had escalated into something much bigger, something that couldn't be ignored. "Look, let's just calm down," the older officer said, his voice now more tentative. "We'll get this sorted out. No need to escalate it further." But it was too late for calm. The tension in the air was palpable. The damage had been done. The young officer, still struggling with the reality of what was happening, took a step back. For a moment, it seemed like he might back off. But then the sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot caught everyone's attention. A tall, imposing figure stepped out of a black SUV, Deputy Chief Paulson. Ethan recognized him immediately. He had seen him in news conferences and public events, the face of the local police department's efforts to project an image of professionalism and respectability. But Ethan knew better. He knew that appearances could be deceiving. Deputy Chief Paulson strode confidently toward the scene, his eyes scanning the situation with practiced efficiency. He was the one in charge, the one who could make this go away, or make it worse. Ethan stood tall, facing him, his eyes never leaving Paulson's. "I'm Ethan Parker, an FBI agent," Ethan said again, his voice steady, "and I demand to know why I am being treated this way." Paulson, who had been briefed on the situation, looked from Ethan to the officers, his expression unreadable. "I understand there's been some confusion," he said, his tone professional but guarded. "I'll handle this. Let's talk inside." The younger officer, clearly relieved to have someone else take charge, stepped back. The older officer, however, remained tense, his body language still defensive. Ethan could see that Paulson wasn't taking the situation lightly. He knew that the press and public opinion were watching, and he had to act quickly. "We're going to resolve this," Paulson said to Ethan, his voice firm, "but I need you to understand that this was not personal." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He was done with the excuses. He was done with being treated like an outsider in his own country. "I don't care about your excuses," Ethan said coldly. "This is about the law, and what you're doing is illegal. You don't get to decide who's guilty based on how someone looks or where they come from. Not anymore." Lena stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "And don't think we'll let this slide. We're not going to walk away from this. You will answer for what you've done to my family." Deputy Chief Paulson finally nodded, his expression softening slightly, though the tension still lingered. "I'll make sure this is handled properly," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier sharpness. "But we need to de-escalate this before it gets out of hand." Ethan didn't trust him. He had heard too many promises from people in power, promises that always seemed to fade when the dust settled. But for now, he had to stay calm, for his family's sake. As the officers began to withdraw, Deputy Chief Paulson turned to Lena. "I'll make sure you get a full report," he said, his voice now carrying a note of apology. "And we'll look into this thoroughly." But Lena wasn't satisfied. "This isn't just about a report," she snapped. "This is about accountability. And I'll make sure you're held accountable for what you've done today." The crowd that had gathered around them began to disperse, but the tension remained. The phones stopped recording, but the whispers didn't. People had seen what had happened, and now everyone knew that the Parker family wasn't going to let this injustice go.